The moment Annie Atwood saw the portrait hanging behind the bar of the Dusty Spur Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, her heart stopped beating for 3 full seconds, and her breath left her body as though someone had driven a fist straight into her chest. It was her mother's face staring back at her from that canvas. Her mother's dark eyes, her mother's silver-streaked hair pinned in careful curls at the nape of her neck, her mother's hands folded in that particular patient way across the lap of her Sunday dress. The portrait had been painted in 1871, when Annie was just 7 years old, and she remembered sitting beside her father while the traveling painter worked in their parlor in Wichita. She remembered the smell of turpentine and linseed oil, the way her mother had kept very still for hours, only breaking her composure to wink at Annie when the painter looked away. She remembered the mahogany frame her father had carved himself, the small rose he had worked into the bottom left corner because roses had been her mother's favorite. That rose was there now, peeking out beneath a smear of tobacco ash someone had wiped carelessly across the corner of the frame. Annie stood in the doorway of the Dusty Spur on a Thursday afternoon in October of 1882, the dry Kansas wind pushing dust against the backs of her legs, and she could not move. She was 22 years old. She had ridden 40 miles from her brother Eli's homestead to pick up supplies, and she had stepped into the saloon only to ask whether the barkeep had seen a man named Cooper Vance, who owed Eli money for a fence repair. She had not expected this. She had not been prepared for this. Her mother had been dead for 4 years. Her father had died 6 months after her, some combination of grief and a chest cold that never quite left him. The portrait had disappeared during the chaos of settling her parents' estate, when Annie and Eli had been too broken with mourning to keep proper watch over the house, while relatives and neighbors came in and out bearing casseroles and condolences. They had assumed someone had taken it by mistake, or perhaps it had been sold along with some furniture to cover debts. They had searched for it without success and had eventually, painfully, let the matter rest. But here it was. Here she was. Behind a bar in Caldwell, Kansas, watching over a room full of card players and whiskey drinkers as though she had always belonged there. Annie pulled herself together with the fierce practicality that had been her primary inheritance from the woman in the painting. She crossed the sawdust floor, stepped up to the bar, and waited until the barkeep turned around. He was a wide man with a red face and small eyes, and he looked at her with the particular mixture of annoyance and curiosity that men in saloons always directed at women who came in alone. "That portrait," Annie said, keeping her voice steady. "Where did you get it?" The barkeep glanced over his shoulder as though he had forgotten the painting existed. "Bought it," he said. "From whom?" "Fellow named Garrett, Silas Garrett. He came through about 3 weeks back selling odds and ends out of a wagon. I gave him $4 for it, thought it gave the place a touch of class." He said this without apparent irony. "That portrait belongs to my family," Annie said. "The woman in it is my mother, Catherine Atwood. She died in 1878. My father painted that frame himself. If you look at the bottom corner, you will see a rose he carved there." The barkeep squinted at her. "That may be," he said carefully. "But I paid $4 for it." "I understand that," Annie said, "and I am sorry that you were sold something that was not rightfully the seller's to sell, but I am asking you to consider doing the right thing." The barkeep scratched the back of his neck and looked at the portrait again. Then he looked at Annie. "You got $4. Annie had $11.30 to her name, every cent of which was earmarked for the supplies Eli needed before winter closed in properly. She did not have $4 to spare. She thought of her brother's children, her nephew Thomas and her niece Clara, and the long cold months ahead, and she thought of her mother's face, and she stood there at the bar of the Dusty Spur and felt the peculiar agony of being unable to choose between two things that both mattered absolutely. "I do not have $4 available to me right now," she said. "But I could return with the money." The barkeep shrugged. "Portrait's not going anywhere today," he said, "but I bought it fair and I'm not giving it away for sentiment." Annie nodded once tightly and turned to go. She had made it almost to the door when a voice stopped her. "Excuse me, ma'am." She turned. A man was sitting at the nearest card table, and he was looking at her with frank attention. He was perhaps 28 or 30, lean and weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, with dark brown hair grown a little long beneath a battered hat, and eyes the color of creek water in the shade, somewhere between gray and green. He had a decent face, honest-looking, with a jaw that suggested stubbornness and a mouth that suggested he might sometimes find things funny even when he ought to be serious. He was wearing working clothes, dusty from the trail, and the calluses on his hands were the kind that came from roping and riding, not from sitting behind a desk. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said. He had already put his cards face down on the table, apparently unconcerned about the other players. "That portrait. It truly belonged to your family." "It did," Annie said. She was not in the habit of explaining herself to strangers, but something in his directness made rudeness seem like more effort than it was worth. "The woman in it is your mother." "She was." He nodded slowly, studying the painting with new attention. "She has your eyes," he said. Annie had not expected that. She had not expected him to notice or to say so. She felt something shift slightly in her chest, a small loosening of the tight knot that had formed the moment she walked in, but she kept her expression composed. "I am going to work out how to buy it back," she told him, because he seemed to be waiting for some conclusion to the story. "I just need a little time." "How much time?" "I am not certain. A week, perhaps 2, once I have spoken to my brother." The man picked up his hat from the table beside him and turned it in his hands once, thoughtfully. Then he stood up. He was taller than she had estimated, broad through the shoulders in a way his loose shirt somewhat disguised when he was seated. "My name is Amos Holloway," he said. "I run cattle about 12 miles east of here near the Chicaskia. I have been meaning to reduce my herd before winter anyway." He paused. The barkeep paid $4. In cattle, that's roughly 1 head depending on the market. "I have 3 I've been meaning to move. Would he take a trade?" Annie stared at him. "I am sorry." "Would he take 3 head of cattle in trade for the portrait?" "You do not know me," Annie said flatly, because she felt the need to point this out before anything else was said. "No," Amos Holloway agreed. "I do not. But I know what that painting looks like, and I know what your face looked like when you saw it, and I think a person's mother ought to belong to them." He said it simply, without ceremony, as though it were just a plain fact that anyone reasonable would agree with. Annie looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze without flinching, without any of the calculation she might have expected from a man making an offer like this to a woman he'd never spoken to before. He did not seem to be performing generosity. He seemed to simply mean it. "That is an extraordinarily generous offer," she said carefully. "I cannot accept a gift of that size from a stranger." "It is not a gift," he said. "It is a trade. You will pay me back." "With what? I just told you I do not have $4 available." "You can owe me," he said. "I am not worried about it." "You should be," she said. "You do not know whether I am good for it." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "I expect I can find out." Annie looked at the portrait. She looked at Amos Holloway. She made a decision. "My name is Annie Atwood," she said. "My brother Eli Atwood has a homestead about 40 miles northwest of here, near the Salt Fork. I can be there for the next several months. If you are serious about this offer, I will accept it, and I will repay you. And I want that arrangement written down so there is no misunderstanding between us." "Agreed," he said immediately. She found a piece of paper in her saddlebag, and he produced a pencil from his shirt pocket, which told her he was a man who kept himself prepared for things. And they wrote out a simple agreement at the card table, while the other players watched with varying degrees of amusement and bewilderment. Annie Atwood acknowledged a debt to Amos Holloway in the amount of $4 and any reasonable costs associated with the transportation of 3 head of cattle to the Dusty Spur Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas. Both of them signed it. Then Amos Holloway went and spoke to the barkeep for 10 minutes while Annie waited, and the barkeep looked at Annie and looked at Amos and scratched his red neck some more and finally nodded. Amos shook the man's hand. He came back to where Annie was standing and said, "He'll take delivery of the cattle within the week. The portrait is yours." Between the two of them, they took the painting down from the wall. It was heavier than Annie remembered, or perhaps she was just more conscious of it now, of what it represented and what it had cost to get it back. She wrapped it carefully in her extra blanket from the saddlebag. Her hands were completely steady. She was very proud of that. Outside in the street, she secured the portrait across her horse as best she could, and when she straightened up and turned around, Amos Holloway was standing a few feet away, holding his own horse's reins and watching her with a calm expression she was beginning to recognize as simply the way his face worked. "Thank you," she said. She meant it in a way that went well past the two words. "I mean that sincerely." "I know you do," he said. "I will repay you. I want you to know that I am not someone who forgets a debt." "I do not doubt it." He settled his hat. "I will be driving cattle past the Salt Fork Road in about 4 days. I will stop and let your brother know the arrangement if that is all right." "That is perfectly all right," she said. "Eli will want to thank you himself." She mounted her horse and gathered the reins. She looked down at him from the saddle, and he was looking up at her. And there was a moment that was slightly longer than it needed to be, where neither of them said anything, and the October wind moved down the street between them carrying the smell of wood smoke and dry grass. "4 days," she said. "4 days," he confirmed. She rode north out of Caldwell with her mother's face wrapped in wool on the back of her horse, and she did not look back, but she was aware of how long the sound of the town took to fade behind her. The 40 miles back to Eli's homestead took most of the rest of the day and into the blue dusk, and Annie rode through the fading light thinking about the look on her brother's face when she arrived without all the supplies but with the portrait instead. She thought about how to explain what she had done and what she had agreed to, and she thought, with an honesty she allowed herself only because she was alone on a Kansas plain with no one to observe her, about the color of Amos Holloway's eyes. Eli Atwood was 30 years old and looked it, worn a little thin by homesteading, and by the years that had passed since their parents died, but his face when he saw the portrait was the face of a boy again, unguarded and struck through with something raw. He said nothing for almost a full minute. He just stood in the doorway of his house with the oil lamp throwing yellow light over everything, and looked at his mother's face. Then he said very quietly, "Where did you find it?" Annie told him. She told him everything, including Amos Holloway, including the cattle, including the piece of paper they had signed. Eli listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him, and when she finished he looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "This man traded 3 head of cattle for a portrait of our mother," he said, "for a woman he had never met." "Yes. And you think he is trustworthy?" "I think he was honest with me in every particular," Annie said, "which is the best anyone can say of a stranger." Eli was quiet again. His wife Margaret had come to stand in the kitchen doorway with their son Thomas on her hip, and she was watching Annie with the warm, knowing look she had always been able to produce that made Annie feel slightly transparent. "He is coming by in 4 days," Annie said, addressing this somewhat to Margaret rather than Eli because Margaret's face was easier to look at just then. "To let Eli know about the arrangement. I said that was all right." "Of course it is," Margaret said. "He will stay for supper." This was not a question. This was Margaret being Margaret, which meant that the matter was settled and need not be discussed further. They hung the portrait that night on the wall of Eli's parlor, in the space between the window and the fireplace, where the evening light would catch it just right. Eli's daughter Clara, who was 4 years old and had never seen her grandmother, stood looking up at the painted face with solemn concentration for a long time before declaring, "She looks kind." Annie sat down on the floor next to her and said, "She was the kindest person I have ever known." And Clara accepted this with the gravity of a small child receiving important information and tucked her hand into Annie's. Annie slept that night in the small room off the kitchen that had been hers since she had come to live with Eli and Margaret after their father died, and she lay in the dark listening to the wind against the window and thought about the shape of a man's hands turning a hat brim, and the simple way he had said, "I think a person's mother ought to belong to them." The 4 days passed with the slow, deliberate pace of October on the plains, full of work. Annie helped Margaret put up the last of the root vegetables, and she and Eli repaired the section of the barn roof that had been pulling loose since August, and she taught Thomas, who was 6, how to play a card game her own father had taught her, and she tried not to count the days. She was in the yard splitting wood on the 4th afternoon when she heard horses on the road. She set the axe down and shaded her eyes. 2 horses, one rider leading a small string of cattle behind him. She counted. 3 cattle, just as promised. Amos Holloway looked exactly as she remembered him, which she noted with some private amusement because she had wondered whether her memory had been more generous than reality. He had not particularly dressed up for the occasion, which she found she preferred. He was just as dusty and road-worn as he'd been in the saloon, and he rode with the easy economy of movement of a man who had been on horseback so long it was simply how he existed in the world. He raised a hand when he saw her, a simple acknowledgement, and she raised one back, and she picked up her axe and went to put it in the barn because she was not going to stand in the yard holding an axe when she could just as easily not. Eli came out of the house when he heard the horses, and then Margaret came with little Clara behind her, and Thomas appeared from around the corner of the barn, where he had been doing something involving a stick and a great deal of imagination. Amos dismounted at the fence and tied his horse and turned to face them all. He had a good, settled way of standing that Annie associated with men who were not easily rattled. He looked at Eli, who was studying him with the frank, evaluating look of an older brother with opinions, and did not seem particularly concerned. "Mr. Atwood," Amos said. "Amos Holloway, I believe your sister has told you something about me." "She has," Eli said. He looked Amos over for another moment and then put out his hand. "I want to thank you for what you did. That portrait means a great deal to this family." "I am glad it is back where it belongs," Amos said, and shook Eli's hand with the directness Annie was beginning to associate with him generally. Then he looked at Annie and she looked at him, and there it was again, that particular quality of extended moment. "Miss Atwood," he said. "Mr. Holloway," she returned. "The barkeep in Caldwell was satisfied with the cattle," he said. "The debt is complete on that end." "Then I owe you," she said, "at your convenience. I do not intend to leave it long." Margaret invited him in for supper with the brisk hospitality that was her natural state, and Amos accepted with a politeness that seemed genuine rather than performed. He came inside and took off his hat and stood for a moment looking at the portrait on the wall, and something in his face went quiet. "She does have your eyes," he said to Annie, and she felt the warmth of that move through her in a way she was not entirely prepared for. Supper was venison stew and cornbread and preserved peaches from the cellar, and Amos ate with evident appreciation and answered Eli's questions about his operation with straightforward honesty. He had come to Kansas from Missouri 4 years earlier, he explained. He had worked as a ranch hand for 2 years before managing to save enough to buy a modest spread of his own near the Kaskaskia River, around 30 acres and a small herd he had been building up steadily. He ran about 40 cattle currently, which made the 3 head he had traded a meaningful portion of his stock, though he did not say this and Annie did not point it out. He had no family in Kansas. His parents were still in Missouri, his father a farmer and his mother a school teacher. He had 3 sisters, all younger, and he had come west partly for opportunity and partly, he admitted with a slight self-deprecating openness that surprised her, because he had needed to find out what he could do on his own. "And?" Eli asked. "I am finding out," Amos said, and the corner of his mouth moved in that way it had, and Annie found herself looking at her plate to avoid smiling in a way she could not easily explain. Thomas, who was at the age where he evaluated every adult man primarily on the basis of whether he would be interesting, spent supper studying Amos with the concentrated attention of a small scientist. After the meal, while the adults sat with coffee, Thomas came and stood at Amos's elbow. "Are you a cowboy?" Thomas asked. "I am," Amos said with complete gravity. "Do you know how to rope?" "I do." Thomas considered this. "Could you show me?" "Thomas," Eli said, with the warning note of a father who has had to apologize for his son's directness before. But Amos said, "After supper if there's enough light left." And Thomas sat back down satisfied, and Annie watched this small exchange and felt something settle further in the tight place in her chest. There was enough light left, barely. Amos took his rope from his saddle and went out into the yard with Thomas and spent 20 minutes showing the boy how to hold a loop, patient and unhurried, while Clara watched from the porch steps, and Margaret watched from the doorway, and Eli leaned against the fence post and watched with an expression Annie recognized, because she had been wearing something similar herself. Annie sat on the porch steps beside Clara and watched Amos Holloway teach her nephew to rope in the fading Kansas light, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost alarming, that this was a man she would like to know better. He stayed until the dark made it necessary to go, and when he left he said goodbye to all of them in turn, and when he got to Annie he held out his hand and she took it, and his grip was firm and warm and brief. "Miss Atwood," he said. "Thank you again," she said, "for coming." "I said 4 days," he said, as though that required no further elaboration. He rode off into the dark, and Annie stood at the fence and watched the lantern he'd lit bob away down the road until it disappeared, and then she stood there a moment longer in the cool night air. "Annie," Eli said from behind her, very carefully. "Don't," she said pleasantly, and went inside. He came back 3 weeks later. She had not entirely expected him not to, but she had also not let herself expect him to, which was a distinction she considered important. She was at the well when she heard a horse on the road and looked up, and there he was, no cattle this time, just himself on his roan horse with a rolled blanket behind his saddle. He had brought her a book. She discovered this after he had tied his horse and come through the gate, and they had exchanged the pleasant, ordinary business of hello, and how are you, and is everything all right? And she had asked what had brought him this direction, and he had reached into his saddlebag and produced it with an air of slight uncertainty that she found entirely charming. "There is a lending library of sorts in Caldwell now," he said. "Woman named Mrs. Prout started it out of her house. I was picking up some supplies and I went in and she had this, and I thought." He paused. He turned the book in his hands once briefly. "I thought you might like it. It was a novel." She took it and looked at the cover. It was Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë, and her mother had read it aloud to her when she was 11 years old, and she had read it herself twice since. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that direct, steady look, and she could tell he was not sure whether he had done something strange. "I have read this," she said. "I love it. How did you know?" "I did not know," he said. "Mrs. Prout said it was a good one. She said strong women tend to like it." Annie looked down at the book and then back up at him, and she could feel something in her face doing something it did not ordinarily do, something soft and open, and she did not try particularly hard to stop it. "I am very glad you came back," she said. It came out more directly than she had intended, and she saw something shift in his expression in response, something that matched the quality of what she had just said. "I am glad to be back," he said. He stayed for 2 days that visit. He slept in the barn at Eli's insistence, not because Eli thought anything improper was happening, but because it was cold and there was no proper guest room, and the barn had a good tight stall that was warmer than it sounded. He helped Eli repair a section of fence that had been worrying about all fall, the 2 men working side by side through the morning, with the steady companionable efficiency of people who understand physical work and respect it in each other. Annie brought them lunch and sat on the fence rail and talked while they ate, and she noticed that Amos listened to her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. No performance, no impatience, just genuine interest in what she thought and said. In the afternoon, while Eli rested and Margaret put the children down for naps, Annie and Amos walked along the creek that ran behind the property. It was cold enough that their breath showed, and the cottonwoods had gone yellow, and some of their leaves had blown away, but enough remained to make the light peculiar and beautiful. They walked close together because the path was narrow, and Annie was acutely aware of the warmth of him beside her. "Tell me about your mother," he said. She had not expected the question. She thought for a moment, deciding where to start, and then she told him about the way Catherine Atwood had been the kind of woman who knew the name of every person in her community and their children's names and what they were struggling with, and who had shown up with practical help rather than sympathy when things went wrong. She told him about how her mother had read to her and Eli every evening after supper, anything she could get her hands on, novels and newspapers and agricultural almanacs, reading everything with the same respectful attention because she believed all knowledge was worth having. She told him about the way her mother had laughed, which had been a full and entirely undignified sound that she had made no attempt to modulate for company. Amos listened all the way through without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "She sounds extraordinary." "She was," Annie said. "I have been trying to be like her for 22 years and I have not come close yet." "I think you may be underselling yourself," he said quietly, and he said it looking straight ahead along the creek path, not at her, which somehow made it land with more weight than if he had turned to look her in the eye. They walked a little further in comfortable silence. An old cottonwood had fallen across the creek sometime the previous spring and made a natural bridge, and they both stopped at it and looked at the water moving quietly over the stones below. "What made you sit at that particular table in the dusty spur?" Annie asked. It had been a question at the back of her mind since that day. "I was playing cards," he said. "You did not hesitate at all when you offered." He was quiet for a moment. "I had a sister," he said, "who lost something of my mother's once, something that could not be replaced, and I know what that costs a person, not just the thing but the way losing it makes you feel about yourself, like you failed someone who trusted you." He paused. "When I saw your face, I just knew what the right thing was." Annie turned to look at him. He was still looking at the water. "That is a remarkable way to be," she said. He finally looked at her, and when their eyes met at that close range, something happened in the air between them that she could feel in her throat. "You get things back," he said. "When you can, that is all." She held his gaze for a moment that felt significant and trembling, and then she looked back at the water because she needed to look somewhere that was not directly into his face. They walked back in the late afternoon light, and Annie thought about the particular courage it took to do what was right for a stranger. She thought it was a rare quality. She thought it was possibly the rarest quality she had ever encountered. He left the next morning early because he had cattle that needed his attention. He said his goodbyes to the family and came to where Annie was standing by the fence, and he looked at her steadily. "I would like to come back again," he said, "if that is agreeable." "It is agreeable," she said. "Good." He swung up into the saddle and settled himself. "I will send word before I come so you are not caught unaware." "I would not mind being caught unaware," she said, and then felt her face warm because that had not been quite what she meant, or perhaps it was exactly what she meant which was the problem. But Amos Holloway just smiled at her, a real full smile this time that rearranged his face entirely into something that made her breath catch, and said, "I will remember that," and rode away. He sent a short note ahead the next time, delivered by a passing rider, which said only, "Coming Friday, weather permitting." She read it so many times the fold lines wore thin. He came on Friday. The weather permitted. This became, over the following weeks, a pattern. He would come every 10 days or 2 weeks, sometimes staying one night and sometimes 2, always working alongside Eli while he was there, always finding time for the creek path or the porch in the evenings, always leaving with a promise to return. He brought her things he thought she might like, not extravagant things, just thoughtful ones. A second novel from Mrs. Pruitt's lending library, a small jar of honey from a neighbor who kept bees, a handful of dried wildflowers he had found along the road that he handed her with an expression of mild self-consciousness that she found absolutely delightful. Annie found herself looking forward to Fridays or Tuesdays or whatever day the note said, with a warmth and anticipation she had never quite felt about a particular day before. She found herself remembering specific things he had said and turning them over in her mind. She found herself watching his hands when he worked because she liked the capability in them. She noticed that he watched her too. Not in a way that made her feel observed or examined, but with the particular quality of attention that means someone finds you genuinely interesting, that they are collecting you piece by piece because they want to know all of it. In November, during the third or fourth visit, they were sitting on the porch after supper while Eli and Margaret put the children to bed, and it was cold enough that Annie had her shawl pulled tight, and the stars were brilliant and thick overhead the way they got in the deep cold. Amos was sitting in the other chair, and he had his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, and they were talking about Missouri, about what it had looked like where he grew up, and Annie was asking about the hills and the rivers and the trees that were different from Kansas, and somehow in the course of describing his childhood home, his voice went soft in a way she had not heard before. "Do you miss it?" she asked. He thought about it honestly in the way he thought about everything. "I miss particular things," he said. "The hills, like I said, my mother's kitchen in the winter, my sister's." He was quiet for a moment. "But Kansas suits me. Something about the way you can see so far. It feels honest somehow. What you see is what's there." "I have always thought the same thing," Annie said, looking out at the flat, dark horizon. "Some people find it lonely. I find it clarifying." He turned his head to look at her. "That is exactly the word for it." Their eyes met, and there was that quality again, that charged stillness, and this time it held for longer than before because neither of them moved away from it. Annie felt the warmth of the coffee cup she was holding and the warmth of his gaze and the cold of the night air and the sound of the wind in the dry grass, all of it at once, vivid and present. "Annie," he said. Her name in his voice had a particular sound she had noticed before but never acknowledged to herself until this moment. "Yes," she said. He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing. He looked at her directly, and she could see in his expression that he was choosing words with care, that this mattered to him, that he was not a man who said things he did not mean. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you are willing, I want to be clear about my intentions because I think you deserve clarity." Annie sat very still for a moment. She thought about the person she had become since her parents died, the careful, self-sufficient, practical person who had learned not to expect things to come without cost. She thought about what it meant to let someone in, to allow herself to want something and reach for it. "I am willing," she said, "and I appreciate the clarity." Something in his face eased just slightly, as though he had been carrying a small tension he could now set down. "Good," he said simply. "I should tell you," she said, because she was her mother's daughter and her mother had believed in honesty, "that I am not someone who does things halfway. If I am in something, I am in it entirely. You should know that about me." "I was counting on it," he said. She looked at him steadily. He looked back. The stars were extraordinary, and the wind was cold, and she felt something bloom open in her chest, with a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee in her hands. They sat on the porch for another hour, talking about nothing that particularly mattered and everything that did, the way people do when they have agreed to something important and are finding their way into the new landscape of it. When they finally said good night, it was reluctantly, and Annie lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind and feeling, for the first time in a long time, the specific and terrifying happiness of having something to look forward to. December settled over the Kansas plains with a firm hand, bringing cold that cracked lips and frosted breath and made the ground ring under horses' hooves. Amos came as often as the weather allowed, sometimes arriving half-frozen from the 12-mile ride, and accepting the cup of coffee Margaret put in his hands before he had even gotten his coat off with the gratitude of a man who is very cold and is not too proud to show it. He and Annie were given space to talk privately, which was Margaret's doing because Margaret was a practical and perceptive woman who understood that certain conversations required privacy to happen at all. They talked about large things and small ones. They talked about what they believed in and what they were afraid of, and what they wanted from the years ahead of them. Amos was honest in a way that occasionally surprised her, not volunteering feeling in a performed way, but answering directly when she asked him things. And she found that she trusted his directness more than she would have trusted elaborate reassurance. She told him about the year after her mother died, how she had become her father's primary caretaker through the 6 months of his decline, how she had sometimes sat up all night with him listening to him breathe, and had been terrified every morning when she woke. How after he died she had felt, beneath the grief, a complicated shame about the relief, because he had suffered so much, and she had loved him so much and had been so exhausted. Amos listened to all of it without flinching, and when she was done he said, "Relief after a long suffering is not a sin. It is what love costs. You carried it faithfully." She had not cried about any of it in a very long time. She came close then. He asked about the portrait, about Silas Garrett, the man who had sold it. She told him she had been through every possibility in her mind and could not determine with certainty who Garrett was or how he had come by it. Most likely he had been one of the many people who had come through the house after her parents' deaths, some of them strangers known only distantly to family friends, the kind of person who might see an unattended item and take it with a rationalization that it was abandoned or unclaimed. Should I have tried to find him, she asked, not because she thought Amos would have the answer, but because she had wondered. For what purpose, he asked. Justice, perhaps. Amos considered this. He sold something that was not his to sell. That is theft, but you have the portrait back. What justice looks like beyond that, I am not certain it would be worth what it would cost you to pursue it. That is practical, she said. Is that wrong? No, she said. It is probably right. I just sometimes feel that being practical about injustice is its own kind of compromise. He nodded slowly. That is true, he said, and she could tell he was actually thinking about it rather than simply agreeing. I suppose the question is whether the pursuit changes the wrong or just the pursuer. It was the kind of thing he said sometimes, simple and considered, that made her understand him a little better. Christmas came, and Amos spent it with the Atwood family, arriving on Christmas Eve with a tree he had cut somewhere and dragged behind his horse on a rope, which had resulted in the tree losing several branches along the road, and arriving in a somewhat informal condition, which made everyone laugh and which Thomas declared was the best Christmas tree he had ever seen. They decorated it with paper chains and dried berries, and a few glass ornaments that Margaret had brought from Ohio in her trousseau, and they had Christmas dinner by the fire, and the portrait watched over all of them from its place on the wall. After dinner, when the children were in bed and Eli had fallen asleep in his chair with his boots on and Margaret had diplomatically gone to find a blanket to cover him, Amos and Annie sat by the fire together, close enough that their shoulders touched, which was new and which she had allowed by not moving away when he sat down, which was its own kind of statement. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. He was looking at the fire. "I have never met anyone who was quite what you are," he said. "I am not sure I have words for it exactly. You are," he paused, working it out. "You are genuinely yourself, all the time. You do not adjust yourself for people. You are the same person in every room, and it is a very good person, and I find it," another pause. "I find it remarkable, and I want you to know I see it." Annie was quiet for a moment, holding the warmth of what he had said. She was aware of the fire's crackle and Eli's soft snore across the room and the particular intimacy of a winter night by a hearth. "I see you too," she said, in case that was not clear. He turned to look at her then, and they were very close, and his eyes in the firelight were warm and certain, and he lifted one hand and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear very gently, with the deliberate care of someone doing something for the first time that they intend to do right, and then he leaned forward and kissed her. It was a brief kiss, soft and sure, and when it ended he did not move away immediately but stayed close, his forehead almost touching hers. "I intend to ask you to marry me," he said quietly. "Not tonight. I want to do it properly, but I want you to know that is where this is going for me." She pulled back just far enough to see his face clearly. He met her gaze without wavering. "I want you to know where it is going for me too," she said. "So when you ask, you will not be surprised by the answer." He smiled then, slow and full and completely genuine, and she thought she could look at that smile for a very long time without tiring of it. The new year came in with a blizzard that kept Amos at the homestead for 4 days because the roads were impassable, which turned out to be among the most pleasant 4 days Annie had spent in recent memory. They were all snowed in together, the 5 of them plus Amos, and there was something deeply comfortable about the enforced togetherness of it, the card games and the shared cooking and the stories told by lamplight. Amos taught Thomas 3 rope tricks and taught Clara a song from Missouri and helped Eli mend a piece of harness and told Annie, one evening when they had a moment alone in the kitchen while she was washing dishes and he was drying them without being asked, that he had been thinking about expanding his operation. "I want to add to the herd this spring," he said, "and I have been considering whether the land to the east of my current property might be available. There is a good creek on it and the grass is fair." "That sounds sensible," Annie said. "It would require putting up a proper house," he said carefully, not looking at her but at the dish he was drying. "What I have now is adequate for 1 person, but it would not suit 2. Annie concentrated on the pot she was washing. "And what sort of house were you imagining?" she asked with equal care. "Something solid," he said. "Not large, but solid, with a good kitchen and south-facing windows." She handed him the pot. "South-facing windows are important," she agreed, "for the light." "Exactly," he said, and they did not look at each other, and they were both, she suspected, containing expressions that would have given them away entirely if observed. The blizzard cleared, and Amos dug out the path to the barn and the road beyond it and departed for the Chicaskia to check on his cattle, and Eli watched him go and then looked at Annie with his eyebrows raised. "He is building you a house," Eli said. "He is expanding his operation," Annie said. "Annie." "Eli." "He dried all your dishes." He was being helpful. "He dried the dishes for 2 hours," Eli said. "Amos Holloway is building you a house, and you know it, and I know it, and I am going to have a conversation with him the next time he comes." Annie felt warmth rise in her face, which was unusual and slightly annoying. "You will have whatever conversation you and he need to have," she said. "I am only telling you not to make it formal and uncomfortable because neither of us are those kinds of people." Eli studied her for a long moment. His expression was complicated, with older brother seriousness and something underneath that was much softer. "You are happy," he said, quietly and somewhat wonderingly, as though this was something he had been waiting to see for a long time. "I am getting there," Annie said honestly, which was the truest thing she had said in a while. February arrived, bitter and clear, and with it came a complication. A man named Garrett came to the homestead. He arrived on a cold Tuesday morning when Eli and Amos, who was visiting, were both in the barn. Annie answered the door to find a lean, weathered man of perhaps 45 with a sharp face and a coat that had seen better decades. He had a way of standing that made her think of a man who was calculating his chances. "I am looking for an Annie Atwood," he said. "You have found her," Annie said, keeping her voice neutral. She had the sense that she was supposed to be cautious. He took off his hat with an air of performance. "Name is Silas Garrett," he said. Annie felt the cold air against her face and thought very carefully about her next move. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "I understand you recovered a certain portrait from a saloon in Caldwell," he said, "a painting in a mahogany frame." "I did," Annie said. "I sold that painting in good faith," he said, "and I have come to understand it may have belonged to your family." He paused. "I want to make this right." Annie studied him. She was aware, with a kind of cold clarity, that she did not believe him, or not entirely, and that she needed to be careful about what she said and to whom. "The portrait has been returned to us," she said. "It is in its proper place. I'm not certain what it is you imagine needs to be made right." "Well," he said, and shifted his weight in a way that confirmed her instinct about him, "the thing is, I am owed for that painting. I paid good money for it myself, and I sold it, and now the chain of events has left me out of pocket." Annie thought about this carefully. You are telling me that you paid money for a portrait of my mother. That is what I am saying. Where did you buy it? He waved a vague hand. A house sale in Wichita back in '79. Estate things, you know how it is. This was, Annie reflected, just plausible enough to be infuriating. It was possible. It was also possible that he had simply taken it and was now attempting to extract money by claiming legitimacy. I have no way to verify that, she said. No, he agreed pleasantly. And I have no way to verify that the painting was truly your mother, so we are at an impasse. He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Unless you would like to settle the matter simply. Say $5. Before Annie could respond to this, Amos stepped around the corner of the house. He must have seen the stranger at the door from the barn window. He came and stood at the gate with a calm, steady quality and looked at Silas Garrett with the particular expression of a man who has assessed a situation and arrived at conclusions. "Morning," Amos said. Garrett looked at him and seemed to recalibrate slightly. "Morning." "Amos Holloway," Amos said. "I have a direct interest in the portrait under discussion as I paid for its recovery. I am happy to be part of this conversation." Garrett looked between the two of them. He seemed to understand that the morning was not going the way he had planned. "I was just explaining to Miss Atwood," Garrett began. "I heard the explanation," Amos said, "from around the corner." He let that land for a moment. "The portrait was recovered by me at cost. If you have a legitimate grievance regarding its original sale, your dispute is with the estate that sold it, not with this family. They lost the portrait in the first place through the actions of someone who removed it from their home without permission. They owe you nothing." Garrett's pleasant expression had tightened somewhat. "That's one way to see it." "It is the accurate way," Amos said. He was not threatening, not raised in any way, just completely certain. "I would suggest you move along, Mr. Garrett." There was a silence that stretched for several seconds. Garrett looked at Amos, at Annie, at the house. Then he put his hat back on and said, "Good day to you both," and walked back to his horse. They watched him ride away down the road. Neither of them spoke until he was well out of earshot. Then Annie let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for several minutes. "Thank you," she said. "How much of that did you hear?" she asked. "All of it," he said. "I should have come out sooner. I was not sure whether you wanted to handle it yourself." She considered this. "I would have," she said. "But I was glad you were there." He nodded. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention that had become, over these months, something she actively looked forward to. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I'm more angry than frightened." He knew exactly what he had done and he came here expecting to profit from it further. "Yes," Amos said. "I think that is right. The injustice of it is," she stopped. She was thinking about what she had said to Amos in December about practicality and compromise. She was thinking about what he had said in return, about whether pursuit changes the wrong or just the pursuer. "I think," she said slowly, "that some wrongs cannot be made right, only acknowledged and moved past. Garrett is likely someone who has been doing things like this all his life and getting away with them. I cannot undo that. But I can know that I did not allow him to win today." "You did not," Amos said. "We did not," she corrected. He looked at her steadily. "We did not," he agreed, and the word had a sound to it, a comfortable, settled rightness that she did not fail to notice. March came in with mud and the first pale suggestions of green on the south-facing slopes, and Amos came to the homestead on a Saturday afternoon with a look about him that Annie recognized immediately as the look of a man who has made a decision and is preparing to act on it. He was wearing a clean shirt. He had shaved. Annie was in the kitchen when he arrived, and she heard him speak to Eli in the yard, and she heard Eli call Margaret in from the garden, and she stayed in the kitchen and did not come out because something in her felt that the next few minutes should be allowed to play out in their own time. She could hear the murmur of voices, and then what sounded like the low, controlled exchange of two people having a real conversation, and then Margaret's voice, warm and clear, saying something she could not quite make out. Then footsteps on the porch and a knock on the kitchen door, which was unusual because everyone came through the front, and she turned to find Amos in the doorway, hat in his hands, looking at her. "Could I speak to you?" he said. "Of course," she said. He came inside and they were alone in the warm kitchen with the smell of the bread she had started that morning and the sound of the wind outside and the sound of his voice when he said, "Annie, I think you know what I am going to say." "I have a reasonable idea," she said, with the small warmth of knowing this was finally happening, that they had arrived here together. He came to stand directly in front of her, and there was nothing else in his expression now except complete seriousness and complete openness. No performance, no attempt to impress, just himself in the most direct way she had seen yet. "I love you," he said. "I think I have been working my way toward it since October, but I know it now without any doubt. I want to marry you. I want to build the house with south-facing windows, and I want you to be in it. And I want to spend as many years as I can manage doing life alongside you." He took a breath. "I spoke to Eli, and he said the decision is entirely yours, which I expected and which I agree with. It is entirely yours. But I needed you to know exactly what I am asking and why." Annie looked at him for a long moment. She looked at this man who had given 3 head of cattle for her mother's portrait, who had dried all her dishes and taught her nephew to rope, and listened to her talk about grief and practicality and injustice and longing, who had kissed her gently by the fire and told her plainly where things were going because he thought she deserved to know, who had come around the corner of the house when she needed him to, and who had known always when to step in and when to let her handle things herself. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes. I love you too, Amos. I have for a while now, and I am glad you gave me the chance to say it." He crossed the small distance between them and took her face in his hands, which were warm and calloused and gentle, and he kissed her in the way of someone who means to keep his word about a great many years, thoroughly and with feeling, and she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back the same way. From the direction of the parlor came a very muffled sound that was either Margaret covering a delighted noise or Thomas dropping something, and then unmistakably Clara's voice saying, "Aunt Annie and Mr. Holloway are getting married," in the penetrating way of 4-year-olds, which made them both laugh against each other's mouths. They set the wedding for May, when the mud had dried and the grass was properly green and the prairie was at its best. Annie wrote to Amos's parents in Missouri, and they wrote back warmly, and his mother sent a letter that made Annie's eyes prick, because it was generous and kind and spoke of Amos with the deep pride of a woman who loved her son and could see when he was happy. Amos's youngest sister, Ruth, who was 19 and had come west to visit her brother before, made the journey again for the wedding. She was small and dark-haired and quick, and she took Annie in immediately, taking her by the hands upon their first meeting and saying, "I am so glad he finally managed to find someone worth finding," which made Amos produce an expression of older brother dignity that was so different from his usual composure that Annie laughed outright. They were married on a Saturday in May in the small church in Caldwell, which was new enough that it still smelled of fresh lumber. The preacher was a man named Whitmore who performed the ceremony with evident pleasure in the brevity of it, and Thomas served as a very serious ring-bearer, and Clara scattered dried flowers down the aisle with tremendous enthusiasm and a moderate degree of accuracy. Eli walked Annie to the altar and then shook Amos's hand before sitting down, and in that handshake was a whole conversation Annie could see even from where she was standing. The weight of a brother entrusting what he loves, and the answering weight of a man who knows what is being placed in his care. Annie wore a dress that Margaret had helped her make from the finest fabric they could afford, a deep blue that she was told matched her eyes, and she carried a small bunch of prairie wildflowers because she had always preferred things that were simply what they were. She stood across from Amos at the altar, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her, with that direct and fully present quality, but there was something added to it today, an openness of feeling that she could see he was not trying to contain. His eyes were bright. When the preacher asked if she took this man, she said, "I do," with a clarity and certainty that surprised even her, as though saying it aloud made it the most straightforward thing she had ever done. When the preacher asked Amos the same, he said "I do," looking directly at her, and there was a depth in his voice that she felt in her chest. He placed the ring on her finger, a simple gold band, and then he kissed her, and the church was full of the warmth of the people they loved. Ruth cried, which she was unembarrassed about. Eli did not cry, but he was very close. Margaret definitely cried, and Thomas told Clara helpfully that adults cried at weddings because they were happy, which Clara received with the expression of someone filing away questionable information. They had a reception dinner in the open air behind the church. Tables made from planks laid on sawhorses and covered with cloths, with food brought by everyone in attendance, and a fiddle player Eli had found somewhere who played dance music until the late evening. Amos danced with Annie in the way of a man who is not entirely certain of all the steps, but is willing to be enthusiastic, and she danced with him in the way of a woman who does not particularly mind if the steps are exact, and they were laughing too much for it to matter anyway. The house on Amos's property was not fully finished yet, which meant they spent the first weeks of their marriage in a comfortable room at a boarding house in Caldwell while the work was completed. This turned out to be, in its own way, exactly right, because they had time that was entirely their own in a way that a homestead did not easily provide. They went for long walks in the spring mornings and talked in the way of people discovering the texture of shared life. They went to Mrs. Pruitt's lending library together and came back with a stack of books that represented their combined enthusiasms, and spent evenings reading in comfortable parallel, which Annie thought was perhaps her favorite thing so far, the ease of existing in the same quiet space. Amos was, in private life, largely what he had been in the months of courting, which was not always true, and which she appreciated more now that she had the full picture. He was steady and direct and quietly attentive and occasionally capable of a dry humor that appeared without warning and made her laugh in the sudden surprised way of someone who was not expecting to. He did not sulk or withdraw or punish with silence. When something bothered him, he said so, plainly and without drama, and expected the same of her, which suited her down to the bone because she had no patience for the alternative. He was also, she discovered, a man who knew how to be still. He could sit in the evening without needing to fill the silence with talk, and this quality in him made the silences between them the best kind, the kind that meant something rather than needing to be patched over. She was, for him, apparently a source of ongoing interest and occasional surprise, which she found pleasing. He had not expected her to know as much as she did about cattle, for instance, having grown up on her father's modest farm. He had not expected her to be a confident rider, or to have strong opinions about harness construction, or to be able to fix a pump with a piece of wire and patient reasoning. He watched her figure things out with an admiration he expressed without embarrassment, and she thought there was something very fine about a man who was genuinely pleased rather than threatened by a capable woman. The house was finished in June. It was a proper frame house, 2 stories, with south-facing windows exactly as discussed, and a front porch that caught the evening breeze, and a kitchen with room enough to actually work in. Amos carried her over the threshold, which she had told him was not necessary, and he had told her it was entirely necessary, and she had allowed it, and then kissed him inside the front door until he was fairly thoroughly distracted. She hung her mother's portrait in the parlor, in the best light in the house, in a place of honor on the east wall. The mahogany frame gleamed where she had cleaned it, and the carved rose in the corner was as precise and careful as her father's hands had made it. Her mother's painted eyes looked out over the room with that particular expression Annie had been looking at her whole life, steady and warm and knowing, and Annie stood in front of it on the first day in the new house and felt, very simply, that things were as they should be. Amos came and stood beside her. He slid his arm around her waist and they looked at the portrait together. "She would have liked you," Annie said. She was entirely certain of this. "I hope so," he said. "I intend to be worthy of it." Annie leaned against him. He held her comfortably, easily, the way of someone for whom this has become natural. She liked people who were genuinely themselves, Annie said. She had no patience for pretense. That does not worry me, he said. No, Annie agreed. It wouldn't. Summer moved across the Kansas plains with its particular vast heat, and their life together grew into its shape the way new things do, steadily, and with a comfortable inevitability. Amos added 6 head of cattle in July, the herd now at 49, and Annie began a small kitchen garden that she expanded ruthlessly over the course of the summer, until it was producing more than the two of them could eat, and she was bringing preserves to Eli's family weekly. She kept a record of the operation in a ledger she maintained with a precision that Amos found both useful and mildly amusing, and she told him she intended to use the garden production to reduce their winter costs by 30%, and he told her he believed her completely. Ruth came back in August, staying for 2 weeks, and she and Annie became the kind of friends that would have written to each other if they had not lived so far apart, and did write to each other. Long letters that arrived weeks apart and were answered with equal enthusiasm. Ruth was a person in the process of becoming herself, 19 and full of opinions and curiosity, and Annie liked her enormously. Amos liked watching them together, she could tell, liked the evidence of these two women who mattered to him finding each other useful and good. They went to Eli's for Sunday dinners regularly, which meant Thomas had Amos's rope knowledge supplemented by actual practice on a weekly basis, and Amos added to his repertoire as Thomas's skill grew, and Clara had decided that Amos was the best uncle she had never technically had and treated him accordingly, which meant he was frequently required to carry her on his shoulders or tell her stories or adjudicate disputes with Thomas. He did all of this with a complete willingness that Annie did not tire of watching. In September, she told him she was going to have a baby. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, quietly and directly in the way she had told him things she meant seriously throughout their months together. He was sitting at the table with his coffee, and she sat down across from him and told him. She watched his face process the information, going through something she could not entirely name, a kind of rolling, unfolding feeling that moved across his features until it settled into something that was almost too large for his face to contain. He reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and he did not say anything for a moment. Just held her hands and looked at her with that full, bright openness she had first seen in his eyes in the church in May. "Are you well?" he asked first, which she thought told her everything about him. "I am very well," she said. He pressed his lips to the backs of her hands and held them there a moment. "Annie," he said into her hands in a voice that was entirely his and entirely new. "I know," she said softly. He came around the table and pulled her up into his arms and held her with the specific care of a man who understands himself to be holding something extraordinary. She put her arms around him and held on equally, her face against his shoulder, and they stood like that in the Tuesday morning kitchen for a long time. They told Eli and Margaret on Sunday, and Margaret cried, and Eli shook Amos's hand with both of his, and Thomas asked if the baby would be a boy or a girl and received a carefully honest answer, and Clara announced that she was going to teach the baby to do cartwheels, which they all agreed was an admirable plan. Winter came again, the second winter, and the house was warm and full, and Annie's garden was put to bed, and the cattle were housed in the expanded barn, and the ledger was balanced, and the south-facing windows let in every bit of the thin winter light and made the most of it. At night they lay in the warmth of their bed and talked about names, which was one of Annie's favorite activities of that period. The way the names sounded in combination with Holloway, the way certain ones felt right and others did not. She had opinions on this subject. Amos contributed suggestions and deferred to her instincts with a wisdom she appreciated. She was knitting in the evenings, which she had not done in years. She was knitting small things, and the portrait watched from the parlor wall, and the fire crackled and Amos read his book across from her, and outside the Kansas wind pressed against the windows with its cold honesty, and Annie thought about the woman in the painting, about the life her mother had built from love and determination and the clear-eyed willingness to do difficult things, about what she had passed to her daughter simply by being herself, fully and without apology. She thought about a 7-year-old girl sitting next to her father watching a painter work, watching her mother hold herself still for hours, watching that particular expression of patient grace. She thought about the smell of turpentine and linseed oil. She thought about her mother's laugh, the full and undignified one. She looked across the room at Amos, who was reading, who turned a page and then looked up at her for no particular reason, and found her already watching, and smiled with his whole face. She smiled back. She thought, this is what love is, not the dramatic arrival of it but the long, continuous presence of it. The Tuesday mornings and the Sunday dinners, and the keeping of ledgers and the reading across from each other, and the laughing about Christmas trees that lost their branches on the road. The choosing of it every day without ceremony, because it does not require ceremony to be entirely real. The baby arrived in March, which felt appropriate because March was when Amos had asked her to marry him, when the mud was drying and the green was just beginning. He was a boy, 7 pounds and entirely healthy, and he arrived on a cold March night with Margaret present as the competent and reassuring assistant she had always been, and Amos sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours without complaint or drama, which Margaret later described as an impressive achievement. They named him James for her father. James Thomas Holloway, the middle name for Eli's boy who had been the first child either of them, had loved in the way of adults who discover they have more capacity for that particular feeling than they knew. Amos held his son with the careful reverence of a man who understands himself to be holding something he does not yet fully know how to deserve and intends to learn. James had a full head of dark hair, which made Amos unreasonably pleased, and Annie's eyes, wide and gray-green, regarding the world with what appeared to be profound, calm consideration. Eli came the next morning and stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at his sister and his nephew with an expression that was entirely beyond his attempts to contain it. He sat beside Annie's bed and held her hand for a while without saying much. The portrait was not in this room, but Annie felt her mother's presence anyway, and she thought Eli did too. She would have loved him so much, he said quietly. She would have, Annie agreed. And she would have said something very dry about his ears. Eli laughed, sudden and real, the laugh of a man whose grief and his joy have learned to exist in the same space, and Annie laughed with him, and James regarded them both with his wide, thoughtful eyes. The spring came in full, and the garden was planted again, larger this time, and James spent his first weeks outside on a blanket in the warm air, while his mother worked the rows nearby, and his father came in from the herd at midday to look at him, with the slightly baffled devotion of a new parent who has not yet adjusted to the fact that this is a permanent arrangement. Ruth came in June and held her nephew with the delighted competence of a youngest sister who had been holding babies all her life, and Amos watched his sister and his son together with a softness in his face that Annie stored away carefully for later, for the long inventory of moments she was building. That summer was the best summer Annie could remember. The garden was productive beyond even her optimistic projections, and the cattle were healthy, and the ledger balanced satisfyingly, and James grew with the steady, purposeful speed of babies who are well loved and have no reason to do otherwise. He was sitting up by the time the sunflowers bloomed along the road, and he regarded the world with an earnest attention that his father said was his mother all over, and his mother said was demonstrably his father's most characteristic quality. They disagreed about this pleasantly, which was how they disagreed about most things, with the ease of two people who find each other interesting even in the disagreement. In the evenings, after James was settled, they sat on the porch in the way they had established the first summer, watching the light go out of the wide Kansas sky in its slow progression from gold to orange to the particular deep blue that preceded the stars. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not. Amos had a hand for hers reliably whenever she reached for it. He told her once on such an evening that he thought about that day in October often, the day in the dusty spur. "What do you think about?" she asked. "About what might have happened if I had been sitting at the other table," he said, "or if I had not been in Caldwell at all that day. I had no particular reason to be there. I had finished my business the day before and I had stayed an extra night because the weather looked uncertain." "And the weather was fine," Annie observed. "Perfectly fine," he said. "I stayed for no reason, and then there you were." Annie looked out at the sky. The first star had appeared low on the horizon. "My mother used to say that certain things that look like accidents are actually conclusions," she said. "That life is always arriving somewhere, and sometimes you see the destination just before you get there." Amos was quiet for a moment. "I like that," he said. "She was that kind of person," Annie said. "She found meaning in things, not in a superstitious way, just in an observant one. She paid attention." "So do you," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the steady warmth that had become the most familiar sight in her world. "I love you," she said, because she liked saying it and because he deserved to hear it often. "I love you," he returned, in the same simple and absolute way he had always said it, as though it were simply true, a fact of nature like the direction of the river or the weight of the sky. The second summer passed, and then the second autumn, and in October, 2 years almost to the day from when she had walked into the dusty spur in Caldwell with dust on her boots and looked up and stopped breathing, Annie stood in her kitchen making bread and heard James in the parlor discovering locomotion, the determined rapid crawling of a determined rapid child, and heard Amos come in the front door and say, with the kind of joy a man can allow himself when he thinks no one is listening, "There he is. There is the finest boy in Kansas," and heard James's response, which was enthusiastic and wordless and entirely clear. She stood in the kitchen with flour on her hands and felt, in a way that did not have words but did not need them, the particular and extraordinary weight of a life that had been built from love and work, and the willingness to believe that the right things were still possible. She thought of the portrait in the parlor. She thought of her mother's eyes and her father's hands, and the rose carved in the corner of a mahogany frame. She thought of a man in a dusty saloon who had looked at her face and known the right thing to do. She thought of 3 head of cattle for a portrait. Such a simple transaction, such an extraordinary consequence. Amos came into the kitchen with James on his hip, because James had discovered being carried was preferable to crawling once a person willing to carry you was available, and he set James carefully on the clean patch of floor by the hearth, and came to where Annie was working and stood behind her and put his arms around her from behind and pressed his lips to the side of her head. "How is the bread coming?" he asked. "Perfectly," she said. He looked over her shoulder at the dough. "Looks like it." She turned her head to look at him sideways. "Amos, I think there is going to be another baby." There was a pause, the same quality of pause as the first time, that rolling processing that moved across him like weather. "Are you certain?" he said very gently. "Fairly," she said. He tightened his arms around her, not dramatically, just the small increase of pressure that meant everything. "Good," he said softly, his voice against her hair. James, on the floor by the hearth, had found a wooden spoon and was applying himself to banging it methodically against the hearthstone, with the expression of a musician who knows what he wants to achieve and is determined to achieve it. The sound was enthusiastic and entirely unsuitable for a quiet kitchen. Annie watched him and felt her heart do the thing it had been doing for 2 years now, that particular swelling warmth at the sight of this person they had made together. "James," Amos said, over her shoulder mildly. "Gently." James looked up at his father with enormous eyes and banged the spoon 3 more times with increased conviction. Amos made a sound that was clearly an attempt to suppress laughter. Annie felt it against her shoulder. She was already laughing herself, the way her mother had laughed, full and undignified and absolutely free, and Amos joined her, and James regarded them both with the satisfied expression of a person who has successfully made something happen. Outside the window, the Kansas sky was enormous and honest, and the October light was the particular golden quality she had loved since childhood. And in the parlor, her mother looked out from the portrait with patient, warm eyes, watching over all of them, and the rose in the corner of the mahogany frame caught the light precisely as her father had intended when he carved it. The portrait, once stolen, was home. The woman it had been made for was remembered, and her daughter was loved, and the house with south-facing windows was full of the ordinary and extraordinary particulars of a life being lived, fully and without apology, in the generous light. 3 head of cattle for a portrait. A debt written on paper between strangers. The strange and certain mathematics of how love arrives, not in spite of the ordinary circumstances but directly through them, in the plain daylight of a Kansas October, through the door of a dusty saloon and across a sawdust floor and straight into the future. A future where the bread rose properly and the herd grew steadily, and the children came one after another into a world full of people who intended to do right by them, where the ledger balanced, and the letters came, and the Sunday dinners at Eli's stretched long into the afternoon with laughter and bread, and the sound of children who had never been told that joy was something to be careful about. The story did not end there, of course, because stories of that kind do not end. They simply continue, season by season, in the patient accumulation of days that are sometimes difficult and sometimes easy, and always, underneath everything, held together by the choosing and re-choosing of the most important thing. But on that October afternoon, in the kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke and the particular warmth of a life well inhabited, Annie Atwood, now Annie Holloway, pressed her hands into the dough and listened to her son and her husband and thought, here, right here, this is the place. And she was, entirely and without reservation, home.